This is a message from the Arcturians.
This is a message from the Arcturians.
In 1933, a man lay on a couch in Virginia Beach, Virginia, closed his eyes, and entered a deep trance state. He was not a scientist or an astronomer. He had no particular prior knowledge of the stars. But what came through him in that altered state, documented word for word by a stenographer seated nearby, would eventually alter the way an entire generation of spiritual seekers understood their place in the universe. His name was Edgar Cayce, and what he said about a particular orange star in the northern sky was this: Arcturus is the highest civilization in our galaxy. Not a highly advanced civilization, not one of the most developed, the highest. This is where the Arcturian story begins. Not with a spacecraft sighting, not with a channeling session posted online, with one of the most documented and carefully preserved bodies of psychic testimony in the 20th century, pointing directly at a star sitting 36 light-years above our heads, and making a claim that almost no one in the mainstream has fully reckoned with. Today, we are going to reckon with it. We are going to explore who the Arcturians are, what they look like, how they think, how they heal, what their relationship to humanity has been across deep time. Why so many people alive right now feel an inexplicable pull toward Arcturus without knowing why, and what their role in the unfolding contact sequence may be as we move deeper into what may be the most significant era in human history. The physical appearance of the Arcturians. The first question most people ask when they encounter a new civilization from the channeling literature is the most immediate one. What do they look like? With the Arcturians, this question has a more interesting answer than with almost any other group described in the contemporary contact tradition. Because across multiple independent channeling lineages, stretching from the 1990 book We the Arcturians by Norma Milanovich through to the QHHT hypnotherapy sessions of Dolores Cannon, a portrait of Arcturian physical presence emerges with a surprising degree of consistency. But there is a dimension to the answer that makes it unlike any other ET civilization in the literature. Because for the Arcturians, the physical form itself is something of a partial story. They have bodies. But the bodies are not the whole of what they are. And this distinction shapes everything about how they appear and how they are perceived. Let us begin with the body itself. The Arcturians are described consistently as tall and slender. Most accounts place their height somewhere between 2.5 and 4 meters. That means the shorter end of the range would see an Arcturian looking down at a 2-story window from the outside, and the taller end would put them at roughly the height of a single story above an adult human standing at their feet. The variation in reported height across different traditions may reflect genuine individual variation among Arcturians, the possibility of distinct groups or castes within the civilization, or simply the inherent challenge of translating a non-physical perception into precise physical measurement. What is consistent is the impression of height and of extraordinary slenderness, almost as if the physical form has been distilled down to something very precise, stripped of everything unnecessary. The head is the most consistently described feature, and it is unmistakable. Large relative to the body, with an elongated cranium that rises considerably above the height a human skull would occupy. The dome of the Arcturian skull is described as sweeping upward and back, creating an impression of extraordinary cognitive capacity, of a head that has been shaped around a brain or a consciousness center of significantly greater complexity than the human standard. The face is narrow and smooth, with a quality of stillness that multiple accounts describe as deeply different from the muscular expressiveness of a human face. There is very little of what we would call animation in the ordinary sense. Instead, the face communicates through a kind of radiant quality, a presence rather than an expression. The eyes. This is where nearly every account of Arcturian physical appearance becomes most detailed, most insistent, and most extraordinary. The eyes of the Arcturians are described as very large, occupying considerably more of the face than human eyes do. Their color is described across traditions as deep blue-violet, indigo, or a luminous dark tone that seems to contain layers of depth within itself. Several accounts describe looking into Arcturian eyes as the experience of looking into something that has no bottom, a depth that keeps extending as if each layer of apparent surface is only the beginning of another layer beneath it. The whites of the eyes, to the extent they are visible at all, are described as barely present or absent entirely, so that the iris and the deep inner quality of the eye fill the whole visible space. Looking into those eyes, multiple independent witnesses report the same thing: an overwhelming sense of being completely known, not observed, not scanned, not assessed, known. A sense that everything about you, including parts of yourself you have never fully looked at, is seen with total clarity and total acceptance simultaneously. The skin of the Arcturians is described in the blue, blue-gray, and blue-green range, with occasional additions of a faint violet tint depending on the source and potentially on the individual being described. But the color is almost secondary to the quality that many accounts emphasize far more strongly. The skin of an Arcturian is described as translucent, not transparent, not see-through in a literal sense, but translucent in the way that certain very fine materials are, lit from within rather than reflecting light from without. Multiple independent traditions use some version of the same description. The light of what they are shows through the physical form, rather than being contained by it. As if the body is a vessel through which consciousness shines, rather than a container that holds it. Suzanne Lai's channeling material emphasizes this luminous quality with particular insistence. Her descriptions position Arcturians less as physical beings with spiritual development and more as beings of light who have adopted a physical expression. The physical body, in this framing, is something the Arcturian wears or works through rather than something they fundamentally are. This is a distinction that matters enormously for understanding how Arcturian encounters are perceived and reported. The hands of the Arcturians, when described, are characterized as long and slender, with a length of finger and an elegance of movement that multiple accounts associate with a kind of precision and intentionality. Every movement described is deliberate, as if there is no involuntary gesture, no reflexive motion. Everything the body does is an expression of consciousness rather than a habit of the nervous system. Communication is described as primarily telepathic. When Arcturian vocalization is mentioned at all, it is compared to a resonant tonal quality, more musical than linguistic in character. What is described more often is a quality of mental communication that feels unlike ordinary telepathy as imagined. Human fantasy about telepathy usually involves something like radio transmission, one mind sending a signal that another receives. Arcturian communication is described as something more like simultaneous full-picture transmission, the entire understanding, the entire context, the feeling and the meaning and the structure all at once, which the human receiver then has to translate into linear language. The experience of receiving Arcturian communication is described by many as overwhelming at first. Not unpleasantly, but in the way that suddenly hearing an entire orchestra after a lifetime of single instruments is overwhelming. And then there is the version of Arcturian presence that many people encounter most commonly. The encounter where the physical form is secondary or absent entirely. Multiple traditions describe Arcturians as capable of being perceived primarily as a radiant field, a quality of light and intelligence and warmth that precedes and accompanies and extends beyond any specific physical form. In healing contexts, in dream encounters, in meditation, and in the spontaneous experiences described by people who have no idea they are being exposed to something Arcturian, the encounter is often of this type: a presence, an awareness, something that is unmistakably intelligent and unmistakably oriented toward your well-being, without necessarily presenting a body for you to look at. This is not a failure of perception on the part of the human experiencer. It is a characteristic of what Arcturian consciousness is. The physical form is one of the expressions. It is not the whole. Arcturian home, vessels, and the corridor. With most ET civilizations discussed in the contact literature, there is a relatively clear answer to the question of where they are. The Pleiadians come from a cluster of stars, roughly 444 light-years away. The Essassani inhabit a system approximately 500 light-years distant in the direction of the constellation Orion. The Yael are described as operating from our own solar system's near neighborhood. With the Arcturians, the answer is more philosophically interesting. Yes, their civilization is associated with Arcturus, the great orange star in the constellation Bootes, 36.7 light-years from Earth. But the relationship between the Arcturian civilization and that physical star is described across the channeling literature in terms that are distinctly different from the way a Pleiadian's home planet relates to the Pleiades cluster. The star is an anchor point, a reference, a home in the sense that it is the origin, the place of deepest resonance, the gravitational center of Arcturian identity. But the actual habitation and activity of the Arcturian civilization extends across what multiple traditions describe as fifth and sixth dimensional vibrational bands. These are not physical dimensions in the spatial sense, but frequency domains that coexist with the physical universe without being accessible to the instruments that scan the physical universe. This means that looking for Arcturian cities on a planet orbiting Arcturus with a telescope will not find them. Not because they are not there in some meaningful sense, but because the instruments are looking at one frequency band, and the Arcturian civilization primarily inhabits another. In the channeling literature, Arcturian civilizational space is sometimes described in terms that evoke extraordinary beauty. Environments of light and sound that are simultaneously structured and organic, in which geometry functions as architecture and sound functions as atmosphere. The analogy that comes closest in human experience might be to imagine a great cathedral if the cathedral were also a living entity, if the stained glass were a technology for producing specific frequency states in visitors, and if the entire structure were responsive to the consciousness of the beings moving through it. The vessels. Arcturian craft are described across multiple traditions, and they have a character quite different from the craft most people imagine when they think about UFO encounters. They are not described as metallic constructions assembled from components. They are described as living craft, grown rather than built, systems in which biology and consciousness and technology are so completely integrated that the distinction between them has collapsed. The craft responds directly to the consciousness of the Arcturians operating it. There is no interface, no control panel in the conventional sense, no instrument to read. The operator and the craft are, in some meaningful sense, a single system. Arcturian vessels are also described as capable of shifting between physical detectability and complete invisibility to conventional physical scanning. This is not a chameleon circuit or cloaking device in the science fiction sense, but a function of the craft's ability to modulate the frequency at which it is operating. At certain frequencies, it is physical and detectable. At others, it is not. The default, in the current era of Earth history, is the latter. Arcturian craft are present in the space around and above Earth in very significant numbers according to the channeling literature. They are simply not operating in the frequency band that human radar and satellite systems scan. The Arcturian corridor. In the Bashar material, channeled by Daryl Anka, a specific feature of Arcturian presence near Earth is described in terms that make it unique among all the civilizations discussed in that tradition. It is called the Arcturian corridor. The corridor is not a physical tunnel or pathway in the spatial sense. It is described as an energetic structure, a kind of high-dimensional interface or gateway that the Arcturian civilization has extended toward Earth and which functions as part of the infrastructure of consciousness exchange between the Arcturian level and the Earth level. Think of it as a frequency bridge, a maintained energetic connection that allows certain kinds of soul-level communication, healing work, and consciousness calibration to occur across the dimensional gap that would otherwise make sustained Arcturian engagement with Earth's third-density population very difficult. The Arcturian corridor is described as having particular significance during the current transition period. It is not new. The Arcturians have not recently established it in response to recent events, but it has intensified in its availability and activity as Earth's overall frequency baseline has been rising. The corridor, in this framing, is part of the reason why more people than ever before are having spontaneous Arcturian encounters, more people are identifying as Arcturian starseeds, and more channelers worldwide are receiving Arcturian material. The infrastructure for connection has been in place for a very long time. The human end of the connection has been catching up. The group mind. Of all the things described about Arcturian civilization in the channeling literature, the feature that most consistently strikes human readers and listeners as simultaneously beautiful and almost incomprehensible is the group mind. The phrase itself can be misleading. In human science fiction, the hive mind is almost always a horror, such as in the TV series Star Trek. The Next Generation, the alien race called the Borg, that assimilates everyone into service of the whole. The group mind of the Arcturians is not remotely like this. Understanding why requires sitting with the description long enough to let it shift from a concept into an intuition. In Suzanne Lai's channeling material, the Arcturian group mind is described as a state in which individual awareness and collective awareness are not in opposition, but in simultaneous expression. Each Arcturian individual retains their own perspective, their own point of view, their own unique angle on reality. What they do not retain is the isolation. The experience of being a separate self cut off from other selves, which is the fundamental condition of third-density human consciousness, does not exist in the Arcturian framework. Every individual Arcturian is aware of the collective, not as a background noise, not as an intrusion on their personal thoughts, but as the natural field of awareness within which their individual perspective exists. This means that an Arcturian individual, in any meaningful sense, carries the accumulated wisdom and experience of the entire civilization at all times. When you encounter one Arcturian, you are in some sense encountering all of them. There is no information that one Arcturian has that another lacks. There is no miscommunication because there is no gap through which miscommunication can pass. There is no conflict arising from different factions operating with different information about the same situation. The group mind makes these categories of problem impossible. Lie's material quotes the Arcturians directly on this point. They say, "We are you, and you are us." This is not presented as a metaphor for spiritual unity in the abstract sense. It is presented as a literal description of how Arcturian consciousness functions, extended as an invitation to the human consciousness that has not yet remembered that the same underlying unity exists within it. The practical implications for Arcturian guidance to humanity are significant. When an individual human being receives what they perceive as Arcturian guidance, that guidance carries the weight of the entire collective intelligence. It is not the opinion of one being, filtered through one perspective with its own particular biases and limitations. It is the integrated perspective of a civilization that has been operating for billions of years from a state of total informational coherence. The guidance may arrive through one interface, one channeler, one felt sense in meditation, one dream encounter. But the source behind it is everything the Arcturian civilization is. This is why Arcturian guidance in the accessible channeling corpus is so consistent across different channelers in different countries, across different decades. Milanovich in 1990 and Raphael in 2026 are not drawing on each other. They are drawing on the same source. And the source does not change because it is not assembled from the fluctuating opinions of individuals. It is the expression of a collective consciousness that has fully integrated its own nature. Beyond polarity and detached compassion, closely related to the group mind, and perhaps its most ethically important consequence, is what the channeling literature describes as the Arcturian transcendence of polarity. This is one of those concepts that the human mind resists, not because it is too simple, but because it runs so counter to everything we have been trained to expect. We live in a world organized by opposition, light and dark, good and evil, self and other, friend and enemy, winning and losing. Nearly every structure of human thought and human society is built on these binary distinctions, and human consciousness has been so thoroughly shaped by them that even imagining what it might feel like to be free of them takes sustained effort. The Arcturian civilization, in the channeling literature, has not resolved polarity by winning. They have not defeated darkness, conquered evil, driven out the shadow. What is described is something more fundamental. They have understood polarity so completely that it has ceased to function as a division. They have held both sides of every opposition with such total clarity that the apparent contradiction dissolved, not into uniformity, not into the erasure of distinction, but into a higher order awareness that can hold the full range of what exists without needing to classify parts of it as enemy. The practical expression of this The thing that shows up most consistently in accounts of Arcturian presence and communication is what the literature calls detached compassion. Detached compassion is not emotional distance. It is not indifference dressed up in spiritual language. It is something much harder to describe because it has no close analog in ordinary human emotional experience. It is a caring that is completely unconditional, that does not require a particular outcome in order to remain stable, that does not collapse into grief when things go badly, or into relief when they go well. It is a love that holds you completely while remaining entirely independent of whether you are succeeding or failing, improving or deteriorating, making choices the Arcturians would make or choices they would not. Human love, even at its most beautiful, tends to be attached. We love people partly because of who they are, and partly because of what we need from them. We want them to be well, to grow, to be safe. Our care for them fluctuates with their circumstances and ours. When someone we love suffers, we suffer. When they make choices we think are wrong, we feel something, whether it is fear or frustration or sadness. Arcturian compassion, as described in the channeling material, does not work this way. It does not oscillate with circumstances. It is not produced by emotional calculation. It simply is, the same in all directions at all times, completely available to everything that is, without exception and without condition. Suzanne Lai's material describes the cultivation of this quality in terms of specific emotional frequencies: unconditional love, unconditional acceptance, unconditional forgiveness. These three are not presented as moral obligations to be forced, but as the natural emotional experience of a being that has moved beyond polarity. You cannot fully forgive what you still need to have been otherwise. You cannot unconditionally accept what you still need to change. And the Arcturian teaching, in this framing, is that the movement toward these states is not achieved by trying harder to feel them, but by dissolving the attachments and fears that make them feel impossible. This is one of the things that makes the Arcturian energetic presence, in accounts of Arcturian encounters, feel so profoundly different from ordinary experience. To be in the field of an Arcturian consciousness, even briefly, even in a dream, even in a moment of meditation, is described as feeling what it is like to be loved without any condition whatsoever. No assessment, no comparison, no requirement that you be different from what you are. Many people who describe Arcturian encounters say that the most overwhelming part of the experience is not any information they received or anything they saw. It is the quality of being held in that field, even for a moment. The unified science of frequency. One of the most consistently described aspects of Arcturian culture in the channeling literature, and one of the most fascinating from the perspective of what it suggests about the future of human civilization, is the complete integration of what humanity currently keeps separate as science and art. This is not a metaphor. It is not the suggestion that science should be more creative or that art should be more rigorous. It is a description of a civilization in which these two activities, which human culture has treated as fundamentally different for most of recorded history, are understood as two names for the same thing viewed from different angles. In the Arcturian framework, the underlying nature of reality is frequency. Everything that exists as a pattern of vibration. Physical matter is a relatively slow and dense frequency pattern. Emotions are frequency patterns. Thoughts are frequency patterns. Consciousness itself is a frequency pattern, or more precisely, it is the field within which frequency patterns arise and dissolve. This is not a poetic description in the Arcturian understanding. It is the most literal description of reality they can offer. Given this understanding, the work of a scientist and the work of an artist converge completely. A scientist in the Arcturian framework is someone who studies frequency patterns, their structures, their interactions, their effects on other frequency patterns. An artist is someone who creates and works with frequency patterns intentionally. These are the same activity. The distinction is not between two different things, but between two different emphases within a single practice. Sound is described as the primary medium within Arcturian culture and technology. The understanding of sound that the channeling literature attributes to the Arcturians goes far beyond what contemporary human acoustic science has explored. In the Arcturian framework, sound is not merely a pressure wave in a medium. It is a fundamental organizing force. Creation itself, in many esoteric traditions, and explicitly in the Arcturian material, is sonic in character. The universe arises from vibration. Form is sustained by vibration. And the deliberate working with sound at specific frequencies, with specific intentions, in specific geometric environments, is the most fundamental form of technology available. This is why Arcturian healing, which we will explore in detail in the next section, is described in terms of sound and light. And it is why the material culture of the Arcturian civilization, their vessels, their structures, their social and creative practices, is permeated by a sonic dimension that has no equivalent in contemporary human life. Geometry is described as the visual expression of the same underlying laws that sound expresses in the acoustic domain. Every geometric form creates a specific frequency environment. A sphere is not just a shape. It is a pattern of relationships between points in space that produces a specific resonance, a specific quality of energy distribution. A tetrahedron produces a different resonance. A torus produces another. Arcturian structures, including their healing environments and their craft, are designed around geometric forms that function as active technologies rather than passive shapes. The geometry is not decoration. It is part of the mechanism. Color completes the triad. In the Arcturian framework, color is not a surface quality of objects, but a frequency of electromagnetic energy that has specific, measurable effects on the layered energy systems of biological beings. Arcturian healing and cultural practice works with color as directly as human medicine works with chemistry, identifying which frequencies are needed, applying them with precision, adjusting the combination based on the response of the system being treated. For the human reading or listening to this, the most striking implication of the Arcturian unified science of frequency is that the things humanity currently treats as separate, music and physics, art and engineering, spiritual practice and medical treatment, may eventually be understood as facets of a single integrated practice. The Arcturian civilization has simply developed far enough that the artificial separations have dissolved, and the underlying unity is apparent. The healing chambers. The Arcturian healing tradition is, in the channeling literature, among the most extensively described and most personally reported aspects of the entire Arcturian civilization. It is one of the areas where the convergence of independent accounts across different traditions is most striking, and where the experiential quality of what is described is most vivid and specific. The concept of healing chambers appears across multiple independent traditions simultaneously. In the material from Norma Milanovich's We the Arcturians, in the QHHT hypnotherapy sessions of Dolores Cannon, in the Bashar material channeled by Daryl Anka, and in the broader Arcturian channeling corpus of the late 20th and early 21st century, a consistent picture emerges of specific environments aboard Arcturian craft or within Arcturian facilities in which a form of healing takes place that operates at a level of sophistication our current medical understanding cannot fully account for. The framework that makes these healing chambers comprehensible is the multi-layered model of the human being. In this framework, a human being does not consist only of a physical body. The physical body is the densest and most visible layer of a much more complex system. Surrounding and interpenetrating the physical body are what various traditions call the subtle bodies, the etheric body, which directly underlies and templates the physical form, the astral or emotional body, in which emotional experience and soul memory are encoded, the mental body in which thought patterns and belief structures are held, and higher bodies associated with soul-level and monadic identity. These are not metaphors. In the framework of the channeling tradition, they are actual frequency structures that exist and can be worked with by those who have the necessary development. Conventional human medicine, even at its most advanced, works primarily at the physical level. It works with chemistry, with surgery, with radiation, with the physical mechanisms of the body. This is not ineffective, but it is incomplete in this framework, because many of the root causes of physical illness and dysfunction originate at higher frequency levels and then propagate downward into the physical. Treating only the physical expression while leaving the higher level cause unaddressed is described as like mopping the floor while leaving the leak in the ceiling unrepaired. Arcturian healing technology works across all of these levels simultaneously. The healing chambers described in the literature are environments in which specific combinations of sound, light, color, and geometry create a frequency field precisely calibrated to the energy system of the being receiving the treatment. The calibration is not based on a standard protocol, but is responsive to the specific configuration of that individual being's energy field at that moment. This requires a level of diagnostic precision that presupposes a level of energy field awareness far beyond what human medicine has currently developed. Dolores Cannon's contribution to this picture is the most experientially rich. Cannon was a QHHT hypnotherapist who worked for decades conducting deep trance regression sessions with thousands of clients. In a significant number of these sessions, clients described, under hypnosis, experiences of being taken to what they called Arcturian ships or Arcturian healing facilities during sleep states. These were not guided visualizations. They were spontaneous accounts that arose from the hypnotic state, often from people who had no prior knowledge of or interest in the Arcturian tradition. The descriptions these independent subjects produced show a remarkable degree of consistency. A calm, light-filled environment often described in blue or violet tones. Beings whose physical presence is gentle and radiant, rather than large or imposing. A process in which the subject is placed in or surrounded by a field of light and sound that produces a profound settling effect on the energy system. A deep quieting of distortion and interference, described by many subjects as feeling like having every cell in their body simultaneously take a breath they had not known they were holding. A sense afterwards of greater clarity, reduced density in the physical experience, and a widened access to intuitive and higher frequency awareness. Cannon herself, in discussing these accounts, noted that the cross-subject consistency was methodologically striking precisely because the subjects had no apparent connection to each other and in many cases, no prior exposure to the Arcturian tradition. She documented her assessment that she was not dealing with a shared fantasy or a common cultural myth absorbed from popular media, but with something that was showing up as a direct experience across people with no reason to produce the same experience unless they had actually had it. The sleep dimension. One of the most consistently described features of Arcturian healing work in the channeling literature is its accessibility during sleep states. Multiple traditions describe Arcturian healing as available to humans during sleep, whether or not the person is consciously aware of it or has consciously requested it. This is not described as happening without consent, but as a response to the deeper level of call that the soul expresses even when the waking mind is unaware of it. The soul, in this framework, knows what it needs and calls for it. The Arcturian healing presence responds to that call. The Arcturian corridor, described in the Basher material, functions as part of the infrastructure that makes this kind of contact possible across the dimensional gap. Souls in transition between lives are also described in this material as having access to Arcturian healing environments as part of the interincarnational process, connecting directly to the Cayce framework, in which Arcturus is described as an interincarnational sojourn site. The convergence of these frameworks across the Cayce, Bashar, and Canon traditions is one of the most striking features of the Arcturian healing literature. Three completely independent traditions, operating across very different methodologies and contexts, converging on the same description of what Arcturian healing is for and how it works. The Arcturians and the galactic community. The Arcturian position within the broader galactic community is described across multiple channeling traditions, with a specificity that distinguishes it from the more generic descriptions of other civilizations. The consistent picture is of a civilization that holds a coordinating and protective function within the galactic community, without holding a governing or authoritative function. The Arcturians are not described as rulers of other civilizations. They are not described as the galactic government, or as beings whose decisions bind others. Their position is more analogous to that of the most senior practitioner in a community of practitioners. Their wisdom and experience are acknowledged, their guidance is sought, their perspective carries weight. But they do not issue mandates, and they do not override the sovereignty of other beings. In Suzanne Lai's material, this is described specifically in the context of the Galactic Federation framework. The Arcturians are described as holding a protective and coordinating role in the project of supporting Earth's transition. Other civilizations, including the Pleiadians, Syrians, and Andromedans, are named as active participants in the same project with their own specific functions. The Arcturian function is described as the highest frequency coordination layer, the part of the project that holds the overall frequency container stable, while the other civilizations do their more front-facing work with humanity. The relationship between Arcturians and the Syrian civilization is described across several traditions as one of complementary function, where Syrian civilizations are described as bringing a more physically engaged, structurally active energy to their work with humanity, drawing on a deep historical footprint in Earth's ancient civilizations. The Arcturians bring a higher frequency mentor energy that operates primarily at the level of consciousness field rather than physical contact. This complementarity is one of the reasons why, in the contact sequence analysis, both civilizations are considered strong candidates for the fourth contact position. They are not competing for the same role. They are filling different roles that may both become relevant at approximately the same stage. The Arcturian relationship with the Essassani is particularly interesting given that the Bashar material provides the primary framework for the contact sequence itself. Bashar describes Arcturians as among the older civilizations in the broader community, of which the Essassani, who are a relatively young hybrid civilization, are a newer member. The Arcturian corridor is described as part of the navigation and contact infrastructure that the broader galactic community uses, suggesting that the Arcturians are not only one of the most advanced civilizations in the system, but one of the most infrastructurally significant. The Arcturian starseeds. There is a possibility you should consider as you listen to this, not as a fact to be accepted on faith, but as a possibility to sit with and see how it resonates with your own experience. You may already know the Arcturians, not in this life, not through any conscious study or deliberate seeking. You may know them in the way that a musician who has spent lifetimes mastering an instrument knows music, not as information absorbed, but as something lived so completely that it has become part of the structure of who you are. The concept of Arcturian starseeds appears across multiple channeling traditions and is described with a specificity and internal consistency that distinguishes it from more generic starseed discourse. A starseed, in the framework of the contact literature, is a soul whose primary origin or most significant developmental experience occurred within a civilization other than Earth, who has chosen to incarnate in a human body during a particular period of transition in order to assist with that transition. The soul brings, even into the comparative density of a human physical body, a frequency resonance with the civilization of its origin. Arcturian starseeds are described as souls for whom the primary resonance, whether through origin or through deep and extended experience within the Arcturian civilization, is Arcturian. They carry the Arcturian frequency signature even in human form. And because that frequency signature is so different from the frequency of ordinary third-density human life, they often experience their human incarnation as profoundly disorienting in ways they cannot easily explain to others. The traits described across multiple independent traditions show a degree of convergence that is hard to dismiss. The first and most consistent is an orientation toward healing that goes beyond preference or career choice into something more like constitutional necessity. Arcturian starseeds feel the distortion and suffering in the energy fields of other beings as a direct experience, not a concept. The pull to address it, to restore what has been distorted to its natural coherence, is not a should. It is a pull that precedes any decision. This may express itself through formal healing practices, through the healing arts in their many forms, through working with sound or light or energy directly. Or it may express itself in less visible ways, through the quality of presence a person brings to their relationships, through an ability to hold space for others in crisis with a steadiness that others find inexplicable and that the person themselves cannot fully account for. The second characteristic is a deep affinity for sound, music, and frequency-based experience. Given that sound is the primary medium of Arcturian culture and technology, this is described as a resonance with the civilization's most fundamental mode of engaging with reality. Arcturian starseeds often report that certain tones or musical experiences have an effect on them that goes far beyond ordinary emotional response, producing states of clarity or expanded awareness or deep peace that feel more like a memory than a discovery. Certain frequencies seem to open something, others seem to close it. This sensitivity is not random. It is the Arcturian instrument recognizing its own tuning. A natural affinity for advanced technology, particularly technology at the interface between physical and non-physical reality, is described as a third characteristic. This is not merely a general interest in gadgets or systems. It is an intuitive comfort with complexity, a capacity to perceive the informational and consciousness dimensions of technical systems, and an often surprising ability to work with technology in ways that go beyond what formal training would account for. Many people identified across these traditions as having strong Arcturian resonance work in fields where the boundary between information science and consciousness is becoming most active: computing, bioelectronics, neurotechnology, quantum physics. But the most personally challenging characteristic, and the one that shows up most insistently across the independent traditions, is the experience of profound alienation from the structures of ordinary human social life. For a being who comes from a group mind civilization, incarnating into a world structured around radical individual separation is an extraordinary adjustment. The isolation of the individual human consciousness, cut off from the direct awareness of others, navigating a social world built on partial information and strategic self-presentation and competition for finite resources, is not merely unfamiliar to an Arcturian starseed. It is described as constitutionally painful in a way that is very difficult to explain to people who have no reference point for what the Arcturian alternative feels like. This does not mean Arcturian starseeds are necessarily antisocial or unfriendly. It means they feel the absence of the group mind as a constant, low-level ache, a longing for a quality of connection and transparency and belonging that ordinary human community, even at its warmest, does not fully provide. This can express itself as a sense of always being slightly foreign, of watching human social dynamics from just behind a glass, of understanding the rules but never quite inhabiting them the way others seem to. A strong ethical orientation and a low tolerance for deception or manipulation are described as closely related characteristics. From a group mind, in which all information is available to all, moving into a world of hidden agendas and strategic dishonesty is experienced as an assault on something fundamental. Arcturian starseeds may find themselves reacting to dishonesty with a visceral quality of distress that others around them do not seem to share. They may find that their own internal processing is unusually transparent, that they have difficulty maintaining the social performance layers that ordinary human life often requires, and that this transparency, which feels natural and necessary to them, is sometimes experienced by others as confrontational or naive. The purpose of these incarnations, in the framework described across the channeling literature, is specific. Arcturian starseeds are not present on Earth simply to learn or simply to experience third-density life. They are here as part of a coordinated program in which the presence of Arcturian frequency in human form contributes to the overall shift in Earth's vibrational baseline. They are, in the language the literature uses, living tuning forks. By doing their own healing and development, by working toward greater coherence in their own frequency field, they are not only improving their own lives, they are contributing to the availability of the Arcturian frequency in the Earth field itself, making it slightly more accessible to every other consciousness on the planet. This is why, in this framework, the Arcturian teaching on self-responsibility is so consistently emphatic. The starseeds' work on themselves is not separate from the mission. It is the mission. The 4 dimensions of the Arcturian mission. The Arcturian mission with humanity, as synthesized across the positive-focused channeling corpus, operates along 4 distinct dimensions that the various traditions illuminate from different angles and with different emphases. The first dimension is protection. In Suzanne Lee's material, the Arcturians are described as Gaia's protectors during the current transition period. This is not protection against a specific enemy, which would imply a polarity framework inconsistent with Arcturian consciousness. It is the holding of a specific energetic container around the Earth system, a frequency stabilization that allows the transition to proceed without catastrophic destabilization. The Arcturian protective function is described as having been in place for an extraordinarily long time, long predating the current conscious awareness of it in human channeling communities. It operates whether or not anyone on Earth is aware of it. It is not contingent on human recognition or invitation. It is a commitment that the Arcturian civilization made at a level of planetary scope. The second dimension is modeling. The Arcturian presence in the channeling literature and in the broader energy field is described as providing humanity with something that cannot be communicated through words alone, an experiential reference point for what a group mind beyond polarity civilization feels like from the inside. By offering this reference through channeling, through starseed presence, through direct energetic contact during sleep and meditation and spontaneous experience, Arcturians are described as giving the human consciousness something to move toward that is not merely conceptual. The suggestion is that the human nervous system and consciousness field, when genuinely exposed to Arcturian frequency, begins to recognize and reach toward that state in a way that philosophical description cannot produce. You cannot think your way to the group mind, but you can feel it briefly, and then the body and the consciousness know that it is real. The third dimension is healing. The healing chamber work, the interincarnational support, the sleep state recalibration, and the energetic assistance available during meditation all represent the most practically active dimension of the Arcturian mission. This is ongoing, largely invisible, not contingent on human awareness of it, and described as responsive to the sincere call of the soul, whether or not the conscious mind knows what it is asking for. The fourth dimension is guidance. In the Marilyn Raphael channeling tradition, the Arcturians describe themselves as offering spiritual and technical assistance when asked, constrained always by the principle of free will. The guidance dimension is contingent on invitation in a way that the protection and healing dimensions are not. Arcturians will not substitute their judgment for a human being's own developmental process. They will not step in and direct you if you have not called for direction. But when genuinely called, the response is described as immediate and complete. And the character of the guidance is consistently empowerment-oriented. The goal is always to support the human being in becoming more fully their own authority, in accessing their own deeper knowing, in trusting their own capacity to navigate their experience. Never to create dependence on an external guide. Raphael's material frames this as the Arcturian empowerment theology, a phrase that captures something essential. What the Arcturians are teaching, if their message is received in full, is not follow us. It is remember that you are what we are and act accordingly. The contact sequence and the fourth visitor. Question. We are now at the question that brought many of you to this video. Where do the Arcturians fit in the contact sequence? Are they the fourth civilization to make themselves known to humanity after the Pleiadians, the Yahyel, and the Essassani? This question does not have a simple yes or no answer, and the reason it does not is itself important. The framework for the contact sequence established primarily in the Bashar material channeled by Daryl Anka, describes a phased process of gradually increasing intimacy and explicitness in humanity's encounter with non-human intelligence. The Pleiadians are described as the first to initiate open communication, a process centered around messages rather than physical contact, expected to become clearly public around 2027. This framing has been publicly articulated by Anka in multiple contexts, including in his conversation with Mayim Bialik, and represents the clearest near-primary sourcing for the 2027 date. Following open Pleiadian communication, the sequence describes the Yael as the first civilization to make face-to-face physical contact with humanity. The Yael are described as the most human-appearing of the contact civilizations, which in the contact framework is a deliberate feature rather than a coincidence. They are the bridge beings, the civilization whose physical form will be least ontologically shocking for humanity to encounter. After the Yael, the Essassani, whose physical differences from humanity are more pronounced, but whose hybrid nature and warm character make them highly accessible. And then? The argument for Arcturians as a fourth contact civilization rests on a logic of developmental sequence. If the contact process is staged to introduce increasingly different and increasingly high-frequency intelligences as humanity's consciousness develops, then the Arcturians, the civilization most consistently described as operating at the highest frequencies in the galactic community, belong at a point where humanity has stabilized enough to receive what they offer. Early-stage contact, when humanity is still processing the fundamental reality shift of confirmed non-human contact, is not the ideal moment for group mind transmission and beyond polarity modeling. Later-stage contact, when a significant portion of humanity has moved toward greater coherence and openness, creates exactly the conditions in which Arcturian engagement is most meaningful. The argument against Arcturians in a literal fourth position is equally instructive. It is not that they would not be welcome or not be significant. It is that the category of arrival may be a category error when applied to the Arcturians. They are not described in their own tradition as waiting to arrive. They are described as already here, already present in the energy field, already working with Earth's transition, already available to the souls who call for their healing and guidance. The Arcturian corridor is already operating. The healing chambers are already accessible during sleep. The starseed program is already well underway. The contact moment for the Arcturians may therefore look different from the contact moment for other civilizations. It may not be a spacecraft landing or a public announcement or a face-to-face first meeting with representatives. It may be a moment in which what has always been present becomes consciously recognized. A moment in which humanity, having been prepared by the earlier contacts in the sequence, has finally developed the perceptual clarity to see what was there all along. This would be consistent with everything described about Arcturian consciousness and method. They do not announce themselves. They do not demand recognition. They hold their frequency, make themselves available, and trust that the beings who are ready will perceive them. The conditional probability estimate that places Sirians at approximately 55% likelihood for the fourth contact slot and Arcturians at approximately 45% reflects this analysis. Sirians, with their stronger history of physical engagement with Earth civilizations and their more embodied energetic character, fit the physical contact model more straightforwardly. Arcturians may fit the contact model in a way that requires the model itself to expand. Whichever civilization makes the next move, the Arcturians are present in everything that happens. They are holding the container. They are guiding the process at the highest frequency level. They are the elder consciousness that has seen this transition happen many times in many systems across the galaxy and knows, with a certainty that transcends any outcome we might fear, that what is unfolding is exactly what it should be. The astronomy of Arcturus. For those who want to take this story all the way to the physical universe, here is where Arcturus sits in the sky, and what the scientists tell us about the star around which the highest civilization in our galaxy has been described as making its home. Arcturus carries the formal designation Alpha Bootis. It is the brightest star in the constellation Bootes and holds the distinction of being the brightest star in the entire northern celestial hemisphere. In the overall ranking of night sky brightness, only Sirius, Canopus, and Alpha Centauri exceed it. On a clear dark night with no special equipment, Arcturus is one of the most immediately noticeable stars in the sky, burning with a distinctly orange-amber color that distinguishes it clearly from the blue-white stars nearby. The color is directly relevant to its stellar type. Arcturus is classified as a K-type giant, specifically K1.53 in the formal spectral classification system. K-type giants sit between the cooler M-type red giants and the warmer G-type yellow stars on the stellar sequence. They are described more accurately as orange giants rather than red giants, a distinction that matters both scientifically and for accuracy in discussing this star. The orange-amber glow is what you see when you look at Arcturus in the evening sky. Its distance from Earth is measured via parallax and confirmed across multiple astronomical databases. Using the parallax value of 88.83 milliarc seconds from the Simbad astronomical database, the distance works out to approximately 11.26 parsecs, which translates to approximately 36.7 light-years. At the speed of light, that is 36.7 years of travel. In terms of the galaxy's total extent of roughly 100,000 light-years, Arcturus is effectively our cosmic next-door neighbor. Arcturus is considerably older than the Sun. Where our Sun is approximately 4.6 billion years old, estimates for Arcturus place it in the range of 7 to 8 billion years. That additional 3 billion years or more of stellar age represents an extraordinary additional window for the development of any civilization associated with that system. If intelligent life developed around Arcturus at a comparable rate, and timing relative to its star's development as life developed on Earth, the Arcturian civilization could be many billions of years older than our own. No confirmed planets orbiting Arcturus have been documented in the major public astronomical catalogs at the time of this production. However, the detection of planets around giant stars presents specific technical challenges, and the absence of confirmed detection is not confirmation of absence. Many channeling traditions note that this question, from their perspective, is in any case somewhat beside the point. Arcturian habitation is described as existing at vibrational frequencies that are not accessible to the instruments currently used to detect planets. In Australian Aboriginal people traditions, specifically among the Burong people of the Lake Tyrrell region in northwest Victoria, Arcturus is known as Marpian Kurk, identified in records preserved from an 1857 paper by William Edward Stanbridge. Marpian Kurk is associated with the seasonal availability of bitter, the larvae of the wood ant, as a food source, making it a star that literally guides when and where to eat. In the Hawaiian and Polynesian voyaging tradition, Arcturus is Hokulea, the star of joy, the zenith star for the Hawaiian Islands, and the guiding light of one of the most significant oceanic navigation traditions in the world. The revival of the traditional voyaging canoe bearing the same name has become one of the most powerful symbols of indigenous cultural renaissance in the Pacific. In the Maori tradition of Aotearoa, New Zealand, the star is known as Ruawahia, preserved in the Te Aka Maori dictionary and in the heritage documentation of Ngati Ruawahia. None of these traditions describe Arcturians as extraterrestrial visitors in the contemporary channeling sense. They describe Arcturus as a named, deeply meaningful star embedded in cosmological frameworks that understand the sky as alive, as populated by beings and ancestors and forces that are in active relationship with human life. The convergence of this understanding across multiple independent cultures, with the channeling tradition's description of Arcturus as home to the highest civilization in the galaxy, is one of those resonances that does not prove anything but rewards contemplation. Conclusion. We began with a claim. Arcturus is the highest civilization in our galaxy. We have spent this entire journey unpacking what that claim might mean, following it through the physical descriptions and the cultural framework and the healing technology and the starseed program and the contact sequence and the astronomy of the star itself. What we find at the end of that journey is not a tidier picture than the one we began with. It is a richer and more complex one. The Arcturians, as described across the traditions we have explored, are not a distant hope. They are not a future arrival. They are a present reality that most of us have not yet learned to perceive. They are in the energy field of this planet, actively supporting a transition of extraordinary scope and significance. They are working through the humans who carry their frequency, who feel the group mind as an ache, and the healing impulse as a compulsion, and the alienation from ordinary life as a wound they cannot explain. They are working through the channels who bring their words into audible form. They are working in the sleep states of people who have never heard their name. They are working, as they describe it, to support humanity in remembering what it already is. Not in becoming something new and foreign, but in returning to something ancient and inherent. The group mind is not an Arcturian invention. It is a state of consciousness that exists as potential in every being in the universe. The Arcturians have simply developed far enough that they live in it as a default, rather than reaching for it as an aspiration. Their invitation, extended through every channeling tradition and every starseed presence and every quiet moment of inexplicable peace in a meditation or a deep sleep, is not come to us. It is remember yourselves. The highest civilization in our galaxy is not looking down at us from above. It is looking at us from the frequency level we are moving toward. And it is waiting, with that detached compassion that does not require any particular outcome for the moment when we look up and recognize what we see. We are you. And you are us.